Little is known about the early life of the man dubbed by the media as the Grabber, but we can estimate that he was born in the late 1920s, based on his age when we see him in 1978. What we do know is that he had a younger brother, Max, and that the two grew up in a house in North Denver, Colorado, which he inherited and later used in his crimes.
It doesn't work. Not since I was a kid.
This may be an important detail in understanding the Grabber and his motivation. In the winter of 1957, the Grabber took a job in maintenance at Alpine Lake Camp. He was also a skilled skater and taught the boys at the camp how to play ice hockey on the frozen lake. At camp, most campers and staff are known only by their nicknames, and the Grabber's striking appearance earned him the camp nickname Wild Bill.
We call him Wild Bill because he wore this brown leather tool belt loose around his waist like a gunslinger, and he got long wavy hair, like Wild Bill Hickok.
The real Bill Hickok was a 19th century frontiersman and folk hero in the Old West, known as both a lawman and a gunslinger. Over time, he gained an almost mythical reputation due to not only the newspapers, but Hickok himself telling exaggerated stories of his adventures, like shootouts over poker and women and a knife fight with a bear. Alpine Lake Camp not only gave him the identity of Wild Bill, it's where he took on another identity. This is likely where he became the Grabber and began killing his very first victims. First, a boy named Felix, who he chased through the woods and stabbed to death. Then, a boy named Cal O'Keefe, who slipped away from the campfire into the woods, who the Grabber cut up into pieces, which he then burned. On a third night, a boy named Spike became the third victim. The Grabber placed each boy's body in an oil drum, then used ice fishing gear to create a hole on the frozen lake, which he'd drop each drum into.
Lake Motto is where we take campers ice fishing, so we store our equipment there. That's the only lake where he would have the tools to make a hole in the ice and dump the bodies.
Later, in 1957, a camp counselor named Hope Adler joined the staff, but she possessed a rare ability to speak to the dead victims via supernatural telephone call with the world of spirits, putting the Grabber's secrets in danger of being exposed. If you want to know the true meaning behind the Grabber's mask, how the blackphone links to both Sinister and the universe of Stephen King, and the true motivation behind the game that the Grabber plays with his victims, then stick around to the end of this video. Welcome to Horror History. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Grabbin time. Apologies to the Harvey Weinstein victims who just had painful flashbacks. How about this instead? Welcome to Horror History. Why don't you grab a seat or grab some popcorn? The Black Phone was the 2021 horror film directed by Scott Derrickson, with a sequel released in 2025 and Derrickson returning to the director's chair, which looked like this. He literally grabbed a picture of it. If parts of the Black Phone feel familiar, it wasn't just because of the shared creative DNA from his previous film series Sinister. He also brought some of the same cast with him, including Ethan Hawke and James Ransone.
Thank you very much, Deputy So-and-so.
In fact, the Black Phone is essentially a companion piece to Sinister, but instead of a supernatural boogeyman like Bughuul, the Grabber is a real-life boogeyman, the type of child abductor that parents really have to worry about. As if having to worry that your kid will develop a love for horror movies after discovering a baggy-eyed YouTuber was not stressful enough. Both films are based on the short story of the same name, written by Joe Hill, son of goated horror writer Stephen King. I know they don't share a last name, but nobody would have taken him seriously if he had his father's name. Well, hi, you must be joking. The short story follows a boy named Finney who's abducted and held in a basement where a disconnected black phone allows him to speak with the voices of the Grabber's victims. But it differs slightly from the films, opening right as Finney is abducted and focusing less on family dynamics and more on the suffocating tension of a child trapped with a predator. The premise drew the attention of Scott Derrickson, who found the idea of combining a serial killer story and a ghost story deceptive and unique. I'm not sure what he means when he says he hasn't seen a serial killer story combined with a ghost story though. I mean, Insidious 4 anyone? The Grabber in the short story stands in sharp contrast to Ethan Hawke's stylized mask-wearing villain. Hill's version, an overweight man who dresses as a clown, was heavily inspired by the real-life crimes of John Wayne Gacy. Gacy is one of the most infamous serial killers in American history, a man who hid unimaginable darkness behind the mask of a friendly neighbor and part-time clown. He was considered a helpful member of the community, but between 1972 and 1978, Gacy held captive, assaulted, and killed 33 men aged 14 to 21. He would grab them, or lure the victims to his house to manipulate them into handcuffs on the pretense of showing them a magic trick. After killing them, he would bury their bodies in the basement crawl space. The similarities between Gacy and the Grabber really grabbed me. Both are children's entertainers, both buried their victims in a basement, and in the film, the Grabber even uses magic tricks to entice his victims. With the recent release of the two-part adaptation of his father's classic novel, Hill worried that the Grabber being a clown would feel too much like a ripoff. So the decision was made to change the Grabber to a magician, specifically the style of magicians from the 1930s and 40s. He looks a lot like Mandrake the Magician from King Comics. There are a lot of similarities, the black and red coloring, the cape, and the sharp tailoring. To me though, the grabber looks less like a superhero and more like some sleazy guy who would try to sell you tickets to his show on Las Vegas Boulevard. And if you've been to Las Vegas Boulevard, you know those guys can be just as predatory as anyone. Hill loved the aesthetic of the 1930s and 40s magician shows, where the magician would have two different outfits, one a magician and one the devil, and he would perform supernatural style tricks as the devil. I think changing the grabber to a magician was a good choice. While Stephen King has never stated Gacy as an inspiration for Pennywise, they're both killers who hide behind a clown appearance and lure victims to their deaths. Gacy was arrested in 1979, and Stephen King started writing It in 1980. It just took him 6 years to finish. Gacy also hid his victims in a basement, and Pennywise has been known to frequent a basement at times. But to fully unmask the grabber, we need to call back to 1976, where the serial killer set his sights on his next victim. While working at Alpine Lake, Hope Adler received calls from the spirits of the grabber's victims, but before she could uncover what truly happened to them, police discovered evidence of burnt remains, along with pieces of Cal's denim jacket, leading to the closure of Alpine Lake Camp in 1958. What the grabber did over the next 17 years remains a mystery, but at some point, he moved back into his childhood home and continued with the criminal side that had awakened within him at the camp. At some point, he purchased the house across the street from him, which he intended to use as a place to hide the evidence of his crimes, as he turned his basement into a soundproofed holding cell for his victims. The grabber created a persona for himself, a mask to hide behind publicly by getting himself a job as a magician, allowing him to blend into the neighborhood as a harmless children's entertainer. His work van, the perfect tool to transport props, also doubled as transport for his victims. It allowed him to watch the boys in the neighborhood, studying their routes and routines without drawing unwanted attention. In 1975, he settled on his next target, a boy named Billy Showalter. Early one morning, while Billy was out doing his paper route with his dog, the grabber decided to take the boy from a quiet residential street after disarming him with an offer to see a magic trick. Once he was close enough, he sprayed Billy in the face with a can of wasp poison, temporarily blinding and disorienting him. Using a bunch of black balloons to block the view from the street, the grabber threw Billy into the back of his van, leaving only the boy's dog and bike behind. He then returned home and locked the unconscious Billy in his basement. At the same time, unbeknownst to the kidnapper, someone from his past was about to discover his crime. Hope Adler, the camp counselor with supernatural abilities, had also moved to North Denver and was now married with 2 children, Finney and Gwen. But she began suffering with nightmares about Billy and his abduction, leading her to search for the location seen in her dream. One night, the grabber discovered her lurking outside the house, but before she could leave to get help, the grabber grabbed her and pulled her into his van. Panicked about his crime being discovered, he drove her back home and killed her, but staged her death to look like a mental health fatality. We know this takes place in 1975 because of a comment made by Hope's daughter in 1982.
She died 7 years ago.
The grabber's 5th victim was a quiet boy named Griffin Stagg. Griffin was likely taken sometime in 1975 after Billy's murder, but spent a much longer time trapped in the basement. Based on the time between the 4th and 6th victims being taken, it's likely that he was held captive for almost 2 years. When the grabber took Griffin, he also stole the boy's bike lock and used it to secure his front door. Afraid he might eventually forget the combination, Griffin carved the numbers into the basement wall in case he ever had a chance at escape. That day never came, however. The grabber's 6th victim is Vance Hopper, a school bully whose obsession with the arcade pinball machine earned him the nickname Pinball Vance.
You think I kidnapped Vance Hopper last spring? Is that it?
Considering this comment was made in November 1978, Vance was either taken in spring 1978 or spring of 1977. Personally, I think if you were talking about spring of the same year, you would just say spring, so to me, it makes more sense that Vance was taken in the spring of 1977. This also fits my theory on the durations each of the boys were held for, which I'll get to. Vance was held until 1978 when he caused damage to the basement while trying to escape and paid the price for it with his life. From here on out, the pace at which the boys are grabbed increases. The grabber takes his 7th victim, 13-year-old Bruce Yamada, on July 18, 1978 as he's cycling home after a baseball game. During his captivity, Bruce attempted to dig a tunnel under the floor, but failed when the grabber discovered his attempts to escape. Unlike the baseball game, Bruce only got 1 strike, and the grabber took him out. It only took a few more months for the grabber to grab his next victim, Robin Ariana, on November 9, 1978. Unlike the other boys who vanished from quiet residential streets, Robin was taken while walking home one Saturday afternoon, cutting behind a row of warehouses. The grabber is dressed in his full magician costume, which I assume is the case for each of his North Denver abductions. My theory is that the full costume, along with his newly coined nickname, are ways for him to dissociate from his crimes, something we see him do in other ways as his story progresses. The rate at which the grabber is abducting boys is rapidly increasing as the length of their captivity decreases. This all comes down to how soon they play the game.
What game?
Naughty boy.
Naughty Boy isn't really a game so much as it is a ritual played out with the grabber. With each kidnapping, he sets a bunch of traps or tests for them. The main one involves him leaving the basement door unlocked and sitting at the top of the stairs with his belt in hand to punish anyone who tries to escape. Naughty Boy is a key moment in understanding the psychology of the grabber. By forcing them to break one of his rules before he can hurt them, he attempts to justify his actions.
Why hasn't he killed me?
He won't play the game. You have to play the game. If you don't play, he can't win.
When the boys try to escape, it becomes the excuse that the grabber needs to become violent while convincing himself that he isn't a villain. It's another method he uses to dissociate himself from the crimes. Naughty Boy also hints at the grabber's sadistic tendencies. Serial killers with these tendencies often create rituals to build anticipation or to provide them with a sense of power over their victims. For example, Danny Rolling, the Gainesville Ripper who inspired Ghostface in Scream, liked to duct tape and tie his victims up to build anticipation before taking them out. John Wayne Gacy would provide his victims with substances before performing a magic trick that involved locking the boys in handcuffs. There does seem to be a power fantasy at play with the grabber's choice of victims. He tends to choose boys that are at the top of the food chain. Vance was considered the bully, Bruce was the athlete who hits a game-winning home run off of Finney at the start of the movie, and Robin was the fighter who other bullies at the school were afraid to mess with. He chooses kids who dominate in the hierarchy of children, but as an adult, he's the one who has all of the power over them. All of these choices would tie in to the reason behind his crimes. While the movie never explicitly shows it, the Naughty Boy game also strongly implies another dark side to the grabber's motives.
If you don't play Naughty Boy, the grabber can't beat you. And if he can't beat you, you can't move on to the next part. And the next part of Naughty Boy was his favorite part.
We see this most clearly when he waits for the boys shirtless at the top of the stairs. For the grabber, there's a level of pleasure in the situation.
I will never make you do anything that you won't like.
Why do I kinda feel like he's lying? The Blackphone's screenwriter, C. Robert Cargill, confirmed it in an article in the Los Angeles Times. The same approach was taken with another supernatural serial crime character, Freddy Krueger. Freddy actually was supposed to be a molester in the early version of the script for the first movie, but they dropped that part around 1982 or 1983 when some high-profile cases involving a daycare started making news cycles, and producers didn't want to make it look like they were exploiting that. Leaving it ambiguous kind of added to the horror for a lot of people, so Cargill followed with a similar approach for his perverted prestidigitator. This wouldn't be the only cue that the grabber would take from the Springwood slasher. Many have theorized that the grabber himself was a victim of childhood abuse, and I think the evidence for this lies mostly within the Naughty Boy game. The dynamic between him and his prisoners mirrors the dynamic between an abusive parent and a child. The authority figure sets an impossible rule for the child who can only fail, and the punishment is framed as something that the child brought upon themselves. There often is a cyclical nature to abuse, especially childhood abuse. When abuse becomes a behavior modeled at a young age, it often repeats across generations, not necessarily because the victims want to become abusers, but rather because it might be the only emotional pattern they know. The Naughty Boy game doesn't feel like something the grabber just made up. The strict rules, the killer's emotional connection to it, and the need for it to play out a certain way all make it feel like he's reenacting an experience from his childhood. We know that he lived in the same house growing up, so it seems logical that the grabber also spent chunks of time in the basement as a child. There's even an old toilet down there, but not in a bathroom. It's more like a toilet that you'd see in a prison cell. His choice of tools to beat the boys with is also interesting, a belt along with a slipper, which have historically been seen as a tool of choice of parents to punish their disobedient children. They're also the same instruments that I use to punish people who don't subscribe. As we saw with the Bateman brothers in American Psycho, different people deal with trauma in different ways. When we see the grabber's brother, Max, it's obvious that he has an addiction problem, which could be his way of dealing with their childhood trauma, by numbing the memories with a substance. I also personally find his obsession with finding the missing boys telling. It's as if he's trying to save these boys in a way that he and his brother weren't. He's a pretty good amateur detective, but he's also the definition of smart but dumb, pinpointing the approximate location of the kidnapper without realizing that the victims are literally right beneath his nose. And I think that's my one issue with this theory. If the grabber and Max's father was the inventor of the game, then you'd think that Max would have discovered what was going on in the basement sooner. Maybe it's one of those situations where his PTSD didn't allow him to see the obvious truth. Kind of like when people blame themselves for something out of their control. As I mentioned earlier, the amount of time that the boys spend in the basement comes down to how soon they engage with the game. Griffin, who is a quiet, well-behaved boy, ended up spending the longest time down there, almost 2 years. But Vance, who was likely in the basement for around a year, and Bruce, who was only down there for around 4 months, were stronger characters who, we can infer, tried to escape sooner. Robin was a fighter by nature, and he was only in the basement for a couple of weeks. It was only a few weeks after Robin was grabbed that the grabber sets his sights on another boy named Finney Blake. Unbeknownst to the grabber, Finney was the son of Hope Adler, the camp counselor who he had worked with and killed 3 years earlier. One Friday in November 1978, the grabber kidnapped Finney as he walked home alone from school by dropping some groceries on the ground in front of him.
Wasn't that just peachy keen?
His high-pitched voice and bumbling, clumsy appearance helps to disarm him, but the boy is still cautious, and during the scuffle, Finney fights back and manages to cut the grabber's arm with his toy rocket. But Finney is knocked out by the spray, and the grabber returns home, this time conversing with Finney from behind his mask, which, just like the Naughty Boy game, is important in understanding his psyche. The mask is split into 2 pieces, so he can swap out the lower half, each one displaying a different mouth, a smile, a frown, or no mouth at all. When he wears the smiling piece, he's trying to portray himself as the good guy and appear disarming. With the frown, he positions himself as the strict authority figure, waiting to punish the boys who he deems as naughty. And when he uses the blank mouth piece, it's a removal of expression, almost like erasing any trace of humanity or emotion. The grabber dissociates from his acts of violence by using the mask to represent his false self, the persona that can enact cruelty while the buried real self remains innocent. By wearing the mask, he can tell himself that it was someone else who killed the boys.
You're the one who killed the others, Bruce. Robin.
That wasn't me. That was someone else.
The grabber is initially angry with Finney for cutting his arm, but then he tries to reassure the boy that he's not going to hurt him and nothing bad is going to happen, even offering him a soda. But the grabber leaves when he thinks that he hears a phone ringing. It's his younger brother Max, who tells him that he's jobless and looking for a place to stay. Unable to refuse, the grabber's ability to compartmentalize his emotions would be tested like never before. Max arrives Saturday afternoon, oblivious to what's happening beneath his feet. But on Sunday, the grabber manages to slip downstairs again and watches Finney sleep. This time, he's only wearing the bottom part of the mask. It's the first time that he lets his real eyes remain uncovered, giving the moment an intimate and voyeuristic quality. But more importantly, it kinda reminds me of my old profile picture on Twitter. And yes, I am still this edgy, okay? I've just gotten more subtle about it. He tells Finney that he can't bring any food down to him, worried that his brother would notice, but he wanted to come see him.
I just wanted to look at you.
All right, buddy. Whatever you say. Later that night, Finney hears the disconnected phone in the basement ring, and when he answers it, he speaks to the ghost of Bruce, which can only mean that Finney and his sister Gwen both possess the same supernatural abilities that their mother had. Finney has the ability to connect to the dead through the black phone, while his sister Gwen experiences dreams of past horrors.
Gwen, your dreams, are you saying they tell you the future?
Sometimes. Other times, it's the dead showing me things from the past.
The powers the siblings exhibit are not unlike the Shine, seen in Stephen King's universe of novels, most notably Danny Torrance and Dick Halloran from The Shining, but also Beverly Marsh in It, and Carrie White in Carrie, just to name a few. The Shine is a psychic and clairvoyant ability mostly seen in children, especially those who are the victims of fear, trauma, and childhood abuse. There's something kind of fitting about the use of it here. Characters usually develop the ability to shine because of their parents, but Joe Hill has inherited the right to use the Shine as a literary device because his father is Stephen King. But horror has a long tradition of giving supernatural gifts to children who have survived trauma. Such abilities are metaphors for what real children learn when they grow up in dangerous homes. Kids who constantly live in fear are forced to become experts in reading things like tone, mood, footsteps, and silence, the things adults pretend aren't there. Horror takes that real-world hypervigilance and translates it into something supernatural. Speaking of Stephen King parallels, I couldn't help notice how the image of Gwen in her yellow raincoat feels very much like a reference to Georgie in Stephen King's It. These shine-like gifts that Gwen and Finney inherited from their mother may have actually come about thanks to their proximity to their abusive alcoholic father. He enforces silence as a house rule, punishing them in awful ways if they disobey, claiming they made him do it. The abilities they share with their mother terrify him, so he denies their existence altogether. But CZ, why are you talking about the kid's supernatural abilities in a video about the grabber? Because, annoying commenter, I've come to realize that there are unmistakable parallels between their father's behavior and the game that the grabber forces his victims to play. Both of them have unwinnable rules, both of them use a belt to punish their victims, and both of them use insane logic to try to justify their actions. I remember watching The Black Phone for the first time and wondering if Finney was really in a worse situation with the grabber than he was at home. There's also an interesting motif of lost identity.
I don't remember my name.
Why not?
It's the first thing you lose.
First thing you lose when?
You know when.
We never learn the Grabber's true identity, as he hides between camp names, costumes, and masks, but there's also the identities of the victims to consider. Griffin's ghost tells Finney that no one really knew him when he was alive, but once he went missing, suddenly everyone did. And when Bruce explains how he lost memory of his name shortly after death, my brain immediately went to Coraline, where the same thing happens to the ghost children who are also kidnapped by an evil, dehumanizing villain.
Who are you? Don't remember our names, but I remember my true mommy.
CZsWorld's Try Not to Bring Up Coraline challenge failed. But as I started to think more about the reason for this trope, I realized that it's a reflection of real victims of kidnapping or murder and how they're often dehumanized, becoming little more than a photo on a missing poster or in the news. Think about it, you probably knew who John Wayne Gacy was prior to watching this video, but can you name a single one of his victims? In these cases, the victims are usually forgotten and are overshadowed by the killer themselves. Once the Grabber takes the boys, their real identities begin to disintegrate and they simply become victim or the missing boy. I think this theme of lost identity extends to the Grabber himself. We never learn his real name, which could be tied to the idea that killers are often immortalized through nicknames rather than their real names. Jack the Ripper, Son of Sam, the Night Stalker, the Boston Strangler, the Scranton Strangler, Pole Boy, they're all examples where the nickname outgrew the person's actual identity and sort of took on a life of their own. Even the Grabber's camp nickname, Wild Bill, refers to someone whose nickname is the stuff of legend, while his real name, James Butler Hickok, has become more of a trivia item. But there is one more interesting twist to Finney's dynamic with the Grabber, which is that Finney isn't the only one with a little shine to him. Communicating through the black phone, Bruce informs Finney that he's not the only one who can hear the phone's ring. The Grabber can hear it too, but just like Finney and Gwen's father, he refuses to believe anything supernatural is going on.
I picked it up without thinking. To see if anyone was there.
What's there?
And while I'm not treating the original short story as canon, given how much the film changes, it's worth noting that Joe Hill's version of the Grabber confirms the same thing. In the story, when the phone rings, the Grabber mutters, "Oh shit, that's just the phone in the kitchen." Of course it's just the phone and okay. His ability to hear the phone adds weight to the theory that the Grabber was abused as a child as well. Psychic sensitivity is strongly linked to childhood trauma. On Monday, the Grabber cooks Finney scrambled eggs and takes them and a soda down to the basement, which is really just an excuse to set his first trap. He purposefully leaves the basement door unlocked and sits at the top of the stairs, waiting for his prisoners to try to escape. But thanks to a timely phone call from Billy Showalter, Finney sees through the ruse. If I were in Finney's shoes, I probably would have died right here, because I never pick up the phone for unknown numbers if I'm not expecting food to be delivered. Later, when he returns home, the Grabber takes Finney some food and decides to test the boy again. Terrified that Max would discover Finney in the basement, he doesn't sleep at night and becomes more frustrated that Finney isn't playing along with his game.
Everything's different. Nothing's going right.
So he tries a different test, asking the boy to tell him his name, a question he already knew the answer to from a newspaper article about his disappearance. When Finney lies, the Grabber feigns anger and storms out of the basement, leaving the door unlocked again and sits at the top of the stairs, waiting for the boy to try to escape, where he falls asleep. This allows Finney to make his first escape attempt, armed with the bike code that Griffin had carved into the wall before he died. He wakes up to the sound of his dog barking, already wearing the frowny face attached to his mask, which is kind of hilarious, and he quickly realizes that something isn't right and finds Finney running down the street shouting for help. He drags Finney into the bushes, pressing a knife to his throat as neighbors investigate the noise. Once they return inside, he knocks Finney unconscious and carries him back to the basement. Finney's failed attempt to escape means the rules of the game are finally playing out as the Grabber planned, and he can move on to the next stage. But little did he know, over the last few days, Finney had received calls from all 5 of the previous victims held in the basement, and each shared details of their attempted escapes, giving Finney all of the information to set up a trap of his own. At the same time, Finney's sister, Gwen, discovers the location of the house through her psychic dreams, and Max realizes his brother's house is located right in the center of the abductions and heads down to the basement to investigate. While all of that was going on, the Grabber prepared for the next stage of the game and heads out to Floro's hardware supply store, where he buys plastic sheets, hydrated lime, shovels, and a pickaxe. All of these events come to a head when Max finds Finney, and the Grabber returns home to a panic at his crimes being discovered and kills his own brother by hitting him in the head with an axe, before turning his anger on Finney.
Look what you made me do.
Which is usually what people say when I scare them or make them laugh while they're drinking a beverage. But it's also the same logic that Finney's father uses to beat his children. Another example of him shifting the blame, framing it as a consequence of Finney's behavior. Just like in the Naughty Boy game, he refuses to see himself as the villain. It's another example where the Grabber's behavior is likely evidence that he was abused as a child. CZsWorld. Abusers will often blame their victims as justification for their actions. In The Shining, Jack blames his family for holding back his writing career, and in It, Beverly is blamed for whoring herself out to the boys. When Finney and Gwen's father beats Gwen, it's a result of the police visiting him at his place of work to talk about Gwen. He frames this as justification for his actions, placing the blame on his daughter, another parallel between the Grabber's abuse and the abuse dished out by their father. Despite the structured and strict rules of his game, it's also implied that the Grabber enjoys causing pain and suffering.
I want this to really hurt.
He calls his dog, Samson, down into the basement and chains him up near the door. It's likely that the dog will be involved in the pain, but we don't get to find out. This is the first time we see the Grabber with no mouthpiece attached to his mask. Following the theory that the mouthpieces represent a performed emotional state, the absence of a mouthpiece implies an emotional loss of control. As police swarm the wrong house across the street, the Grabber attacks Finney with the axe, but misses and falls into his trap, breaking his ankle. Finney grabs his abductor's mask. "How does it feel, Grabber?" And the horned kidnapper desperately tries to cover his face. This is not just a Michael Myers callback, though. The mask wasn't about hiding his face from his victims, it also allowed him to hide from himself. He uses it as a coping mechanism, allowing himself to dissociate, splitting himself into two people, his true identity and the Grabber. So when Finney rips the mask away, he isn't just revealing the Grabber's face, he's exposing the part of himself that the killer cannot bear to confront. But there was one person who was ready to confront the true side of the Grabber. Using the black phone weighted with sand, Finney repeatedly attacks the Grabber before wrapping its cord around his neck and strangling his captor. As he slowly dies, the Grabber hears the phone ring one last time, and he hears the voices of each of the 5 boys he killed in the basement.
It's for you.
Welcome to the nightmare end of your pathetic little life.
With one final snap of his neck, Finney ends it before leaving the house and reuniting with his sister Gwen. When their father arrives later at the police scene outside the Grabber's house, he breaks down in front of his children, apologizing and begging them to forgive him, almost as if he's subconsciously aware of the link between his treatment of his kids and the Grabber. Throughout the film, Finney is called, well, Finney. But by the end of the film, he chooses to be called Finn. He's grown up through his experiences, discovering who he really is, and takes control of his identity, a significant choice in a story where names and identity are so significant. It's a stark contrast to the Grabber, who hid his true identity behind the devil mask persona and never really gives mention of who he really is. And yes, I do realize that the nameless thing is not unique to this Derrickson Cargill story. I mean, Sinister has a main character who we only ever know as Deputy So-and-so. But I think the choice to make lost identity so significant here fits this story really well. The human Grabber may have been killed, but like the ghosts of his victims, his soul still remained over the next 4 years, and we know a little bit about what happened to it during that time. First, the Grabber went to hell.
Hell is not flames, Finney. It's ice.
I am writing this script while visiting Chicago in November, and I have to agree. In hell, Grabby was tortured by being forced to face his biggest fear, coming face to face with his worst crimes.
Hell is different than you think. They take the best parts of you, the human parts, and leave only the worst bits, only the sins. I am a bottomless pit of sin.
Over time, he grows weak, and also like the ghosts of his victims, forgets who he is. His soul returns to Alpine Lake Camp, where 3 of his victims' souls remain. He draws power from their restless spirits, regaining strength and eventually remembering who he is. Once he was back to full power, he set his sights on Finney, wanting to get revenge for what he had done to him. Killing the Grabber also sees the kids' lives improve. Their dad sobers up and stops hitting them, which you could look at as the dad realizing how close he was to losing his son and finally getting his act together, but given the parallels between the father's abuse and the Grabber, it feels like more than just a coincidence. The Grabber could be seen as the exaggerated, monstrous version of everything that the father was, and the basement a nightmare version of Finn and Gwenny's reality. So the father's newfound sobriety feels more like a metaphor representing the broken cycle of abuse. But in 1982, 4 years after his abduction, Finn and his sister Gwen haven't stopped experiencing supernatural phenomena. Finn, perhaps haunted by his post-traumatic stress, rejects the calls, like me when I don't have food being delivered. Meanwhile, Gwen has dreams about the deaths of the Grabber's 3 camp victims from the 70s, leading her to discover the existence of Alpine Lake Camp. Gwen and a reluctant Finn apply to be counselors in training so they can investigate, only for a blizzard to cancel the camp session and trap them there beside the lake. It's not confirmed, but it kinda makes me wonder if the Grabber somehow caused this snowstorm from beyond, to trap Finn for a second time now. I know the Grabber's reinvention as a child predator killer who hunts victims in their dreams has Freddy Krueger written all over it, but there's also a hint of his rival, Jason Voorhees here. That being that he's hunting counselors in an empty camp with no campers. Except for in Jason Lives, the one where there actually are campers. I know all media is derivative of the influences and experiences of the author, but I liked it better when the Grabber was just the new age reimagining of Gacy, because he was much more grounded than the first Gacy reimagining, Pennywise, thanks to Pennywise being more of a cosmic horror entity. Maybe it's just me, but turning him into Freddy with a touch of Jason just feels more like territory that's already been covered. The Grabber tries getting in contact with Finn on a broken payphone located on the camp's grounds. Horrified to hear his captor's voice, Finn hangs up on him faster than me when I realize the scammer on the phone is not my food delivery driver. But the Grabber calls Finn again, continuing to torment him. The following night, Finn snaps and proclaims that he's not afraid of him anymore.
Why should you be? You killed me. You won.
This makes his motive pretty clear this time around. He takes pleasure in revenge.
I want to hurt you in ways that you can't even imagine.
And if we read between the lines, we can find a little more info on what the Grabber's life was like.
You made me kill my brother, the person on earth that I loved the most, and then you killed me!
It tells me he didn't really have anyone else in life, which may be part of what turned him into a killer. Empathy is usually something you learn through relationships, and not having any empathy is the first step into psychopathy. The Grabber claims Finn took the person he loves, so he's going to do the same to him. In life, the Grabber hid his violence behind rules and games in order to distance himself from his own sadism. But with the human part of him stripped away in hell, the Grabber who remains just wants to cause pain and suffering. And he does so by entering Gwen's dream and attacking her, which causes her to experience the same pain in the real world. When Finn arrives and calls out to her, the Grabber retreats. Killing Gwen now would only end things too soon. He wants to draw out their terror, just like he did in the basement, hoping to make Finn and his sister suffer as much pain as possible. Gwen's attack was witnessed by the entire camp staff other than Mondo, the camp chef who worked alongside the Grabber in 1957, and while reviewing old camp photos, the staff and counselors in training realized who the killer was 3 decades earlier. But shortly after, the Grabber speaks to Mondo through the radio.
My name's not Bill.
Wild Bill. Grabber. Evil is evil.
As I've discussed, names matter in the blackphone. They shape identity, protect it, and sometimes erase it. For the Grabber, a nickname is just another mask to hide behind. Which is why Mondo's comment angers him. It cuts through the illusion that the Grabber tried to create. The Grabber is unable to intervene the next day while the kids and the camp staff are awake, searching for the missing boys in the frozen lake. But later that night, as Finn and a friend, Ernesto, take shifts watching Gwen sleep, he's able to take action. He manipulates Gwen's dreams, showing her the truth about his involvement in her mother's death. After chasing her through the dream, they end up on the frozen lake beside the payphone, where he issues a warning. If they try to take his power, he will defend himself. He ends up strangling her with the phone cord, but she hears the voice of her brother through the phone who tells her to fight back. With a blast of energy, she smashes the phone booth, sending him flying. She tells him that in her dreams, she too has power, before knocking him out. And yes, it's very Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors. After another day spent searching for the missing bodies, night falls and Gwen falls asleep on the lake. Once more, the Grabber invades her dream, skating towards the group and attacking a member of the staff with an axe. The limits of his power are a little tenuous, but basically he's able to use Gwen's dream to make an impact in the physical world. The rules could and should probably be more clearly defined. As the Grabber is distracted, Gwen dives into the lake and begins recovering the oil drums hiding the missing boys. But as she does so, the Grabber attacks Finn, choking him with his belt in a scene very reminiscent of when Finn killed him 4 years prior. But this does give Finn the realization. If the Grabber can affect him, then he can also affect the Grabber, and pushes him off. Again, the rules here are not the most logical. Like, if the ghost can have that big of an impact in the real world, then why didn't the ghosts of the boys in the basement just kill the Grabber themselves? Maybe it's the supernatural abilities of Finn and Gwen that allow more interaction between the realms of the dead and the living. The more I think about the blackphone 2, the more it falls apart. The Grabber turns his attention on Gwen in the dream, but as he skates towards her, the ghosts of the boys use their now recovered skeletons to grab at his feet, pulling him down to the ground. The Grabber, now literally on his knees, looks up to see the ghosts of his victims, and is hit in the head with an axe by Gwen. She pulls his mask off, mirroring what Finn did 4 years earlier, only this time the mask is melded to his face and it pulls his skin away with it, continuing the mask metaphor by showing us that the human side of him underneath his persona is truly gone. With the missing victims found, the Grabber loses his power, and his attempts to free himself from the skeleton's clutches draws the attention of Finn. He works out the Grabber's location, and once again, the Grabber becomes the Grabbed, and Finn smashes his face repeatedly into the ice.
Hell is in flames, Bill. It's ice.
And this is the first time Finn actually uses the name Bill. He started off believing that saying the Grabber's name would cause him to come and take you, but now saying his name is a part of his final act of destroying him. Finn slides him across to a hole in the ice and clings to his mask before plunging into the icy water, dragged to the bottom by the souls of his victims before he finally freezes into a block of ice. This ending for the Grabber doesn't feel all that conclusive. He could always thaw out and take over the dreams of someone else, I guess, but a part of me thinks that this is the ending of The Man with the Hands. Way back in the intro, I mentioned that the blackphone almost acts as a companion film to Scott Derrickson's other horror duology, Sinister, but it goes deeper than a common director and some cast members. In both films, you have a protagonist haunted by a boogeyman that they slowly learn more about throughout the story. In Sinister, Ellison discovers a box of Super 8 films hidden in his attic, each reel documenting one of Bughuul's past murders. And in the blackphone, Finney receives phone calls from the dead that fill in the backstory of his antagonist in a similar way. Their sequels are both structured in the exact same way too. Both take a character from the first film and make them a main protagonist. They each uncover more victims that date back to before the events of the first movie, learning more about their enemy while also trying to navigate a new threat in the present. And while Bughuul is a supernatural boogeyman and the Grabber is a human one, both exist in worlds shaped by supernatural powers. What makes Sinister and the Blackphone so effective is that their antagonists remain mysterious. Neither franchise makes the mistake of over-explaining their monsters. Scott Derrickson has wisely left that up to the fans and the horror history guy on YouTube. There's also a stylistic thread that connects both films. The dream sequences that Gwen experiences in the Blackphone look and sound strikingly similar to the grainy, flickering Super 8 films in Sinister. The grainy retro visuals feel like they echo the eras of the stories that they were taken from. After the success of Sinister, you can see why director Scott Derrickson teamed up again with writer C. Robert Cargill and brought back Ethan Hawke and James Ransone. Sinister was an extremely successful series, but it's now been a decade without a sequel. It seems like Scott Derrickson and Robert Cargill may just like the formula of telling a story in two parts. But time will tell if the Grabber is taken off the ice, or if the duo will return to do it all over again with a new story and a new villain to grab the spotlight. And that takes me to what I think is the strongest trait that the two film series share: their central antagonists. Every culture has its boogeyman, a story told to keep children close and on their best behavior. Some boogeymen are a reflection of local folklore or cultural fears, but the scariest boogeymen aren't the supernatural or the ancient ones carved into folklore. They're the ones living next door, and the ones who hide in plain sight. And when you strip away the theatrics, all that remains is the truth. Some people are only the evil that they leave behind. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've gotta grab a bite, but if you enjoyed this analysis, then you'll love my episode on Bughuul from Sinister. Just grab the link to that video on the left. Also, if you're interested in pop punk and metal band history, grab that link in the description to my other channel, Pumpkin Metal. But first, make sure you subscribe to CZsWorld for new horrors every week, ring the death bell for all notifications, and I will grab you in the next one. See you in the next one. Assuming we both survive.